Welcome to Undivided. Happy Friday to you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to giving common sense a comeback. We've got a great show today. I'm really excited to be joined in studio by Richard Reeves. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of the book of Boys and Men, How the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Richard was actually in Washington State, I think he's still here, for a few days meeting with state lawmakers because Washington State right now is on the cusp of becoming the first state in the union to pass a bill establishing a commission for boys and men to look at some of these societal issues that have especially young men in our communities struggling. I think this is an exceptionally good idea. It has bipartisan support. It hasn't gotten a lot of media attention. And so Richard Reeves, in between meetings with lawmakers to talk about this issue, something he's written about quite a bit. He stopped by the studio here and we had an awesome conversation. So we're going to spend the bulk of the day on that. Also coming up, I'm going to read some of your comments about the interview we did with Washington Governor Jay Inslee. We will have an edition of Florida Report with my sister, some things Ron DeSantis is doing that I gotta say I do not agree with. And I wonder if he's just doing it to sort of make a political point, which, I don't like very much. But first, to start the show, I've got to talk about Kshama Sawant. Man, so yesterday I had a pre-scheduled speaking engagement, and so I wasn't doing any sort of news, podcasting, anything yesterday. I was down in Olympia. And I find out that Kshama Sawant, Seattle's Socialist city council member, has decided that she is not going to run for re-election. And I thought, man, I could not get a better gift than this. Now, for the record, I think Kshama Sawant is a perfectly nice person when it comes to, outside of politics. She and I have sat down for several interviews over the years, and she and I have always had just a perfectly fine rapport. But man, those cameras come on, and she gets into her socialist spokeswoman mode, and it's rough. And I will say, so she wrote this in a guest op-ed in The Stranger, which is Seattle's alt weekly, so no surprise there, saying that after 10 years of serving the people of Seattle in her district, she's not going to seek re-election. And instead, she is going to launch a national labor movement called Workers Strike Back. So I'll read a little bit from her op-ed. She wrote, workers in Seattle, through getting organized alongside my Socialist City Council office and my organization, Socialist Alternative, have won historic victories from the $15 an hour minimum wage to the tax Amazon to landmark renters' rights. These victories have set a powerful example that has had national and even international impact. In our 4 election victories and in every struggle, we've had to overcome the combined might of big business, the corporate media, and the political establishment. Each time, working people refused to back down, and we have prevailed again and again. And she goes on to talk about, what she deems as her biggest victories. And I will note, as a socialist, it was remarkable she got elected in the first place, even in a city like Seattle, but she has now become the longest serving member. She's the senior member on the city council right now. And she survived election after election when I thought, surely they're not going to elect this woman again. She even survived a recall effort after the summer of 2020 when 6 blocks of her district were dubbed an autonomous zone. And I thought, wow, then you know what? If that's what her district wants, then so be it. But she talks about all this work she's done for the working class. And I can't help but wonder whether the councilwoman knows the damage she's done to the working class in this city. This city, after 10 years of her on the council, is a worse city than when she entered. And I blame a lot of that on her. I think that she gave this voice to a small group of activists in the city who felt emboldened with her on the council. And they'd show up at council meetings, they'd yell and scream and whine, and council members who were weak would give in to their demands. I think about the first time they tried to pass a tax on big business. It ultimately was overturned, but they went forth and then passed a tax on high-paying jobs. And I just don't think it would have happened. Did you not have, I mean, she's taking credit for it, and I do believe she gets credit for it, but I don't think it's something worth taking credit for. You looked at the jobs Amazon has started to pull out of the city, and, Kshama Sawant has vilified Amazon, and she made taxing Amazon this promise of her career, but she didn't have any care or consideration for the implications of that, for the many, many small businesses around the Amazon campus that will suffer long-term as Amazon continues its pull out of Seattle. She didn't care about them. She just cared about her signs, tax Amazon, and being able to say, hey, I did this. I went after Jeff Bezos. She didn't, she's an economist, and she just does not understand the economy. Plain and simple. I mean, you are going to see devastation for those small businesses and for the hourly employees who rely on those small businesses. And she didn't get that. And then there's, her vitriol toward the police. And during the whole defunding movement, she's the only one who was consistent on that. More on that in a second. But, she vilified the police. She wanted a complete deconstruction of our criminal justice system, a dismantling of it. And she never backed away from that, even when the rest of the council, or most of the rest of the council, realized, well, that was a stupid idea. We shouldn't have done that. 500 officers fled. She's still saying the same crap she was saying in 2020. So I will say you got to give it to her for moral consistency. And I've said that over and over. I would rather have someone like Shama Sawant, who I know what I'm getting from her, rather than these flip-flopping members of the city council that she worked with. But I think she has been incredibly devastating for our economy, for the vitality of our city. I think that a lot of those 500 officers would still be on the force if her vitriol had not caught on, if she hadn't bolstered the voices of like 25 people in the city in the activist class who have the time in the middle of the day to show up to a city council meeting and whine. And so, yeah, I'm so glad to see her go from this position. She's going to start this organization to help working people. Fine. Like, that is obviously where her passions lie. I have nothing against working class people. I just think that as you vilify business, you need to understand the implications of doing that. I mean, working class people have jobs because of corporations and because of businesses. And I'm not saying those people don't deserve to be treated well. But, if they feel like a company like Amazon or a company like Starbucks isn't treating them well, there's a million other places they can go work. It's a worker's market right now. So someone who has been, I think, pivotal to the downfall of Seattle over the last decade has said she's not running again. I think that's great. That makes, by the way, four incumbents who say they're not running this year. And that's significant. So there's 9 seats on the city council. 7 of them have elections this year. 4 of them, the incumbents say they're not running, which opens the field. Now, that terrifies me because you don't know. It's the devil you know, not the one you don't know. So I'm a little worried about what might happen, but it is a significant opportunity for Seattle voters to say, hey, we don't like the direction our city has gone, and we want to put some really common sense individuals. They're going to be liberals, but I'm hopeful that if they're progressives, they're at least pragmatists, and they realize that some of their quote unquote boldest ideas might not be the best thing for the city right now or might not be doable. So it's going to be a significant year for the city of Seattle. We'll see what happens with some of the other incumbents, and we'll see what happens in these now will be open races and who's going to come out to run for those positions. I really hope, as I've said, that some small business owners say, hey, I care a lot about what's happening, and I'm gonna jump into the mix. So Seattle Socialist City Council member, we've got another year with her. She'll serve out until the end of the year. I'm sure she'll propose even wilder shit knowing she doesn't have to run for her seat again. So we'll see what happens. But I think this is particularly good news for the city of Seattle. I've been talking about the East Side Weight Loss Clinic plan because, look how, if you're watching on the video podcast, look at these curves that have emerged from my body. I lost 26 pounds now on the East Side Weight Loss Clinic plan. I'm in a little bit of a maintenance period, and then I'm going to try to lose the remaining 14 pounds of my COVID weight, and then work on maintaining it with Dr. Coogan over at East Side Weight Loss Clinic. No prepackaged meals, no weird bars or shakes or anything, which I love. I can go to the grocery store, shop like a real human being. One of the other things I like about this program is it's demystified the scale for me. I used to be terrified to step on the scale, but now it's just sort of part of my routine. The first time I stepped on when I started the program, I was mortified, and then I lost a significant amount of weight in my first 2 weeks, and so then I loved stepping on the scale. I was like, yes, this is going great. So if you would like to try the East Side Weight Loss Clinic plan with me, lose some of that excess weight you gained that you put on during the pandemic, and just feel so much better like I do, reach out to Dr. Coogan for a free consultation. You can go to eastsideweightlossclinic.com. That's eastsideweightlossclinic.com. Or if you prefer, you can always give them a call, 425-354-3020. I'm really excited about our next guest because I've been a fan of Richard Reeves ever since I saw him on Bill Maher. He wrote a book called Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And actually, for the last few days, Richard has been in Washington State meeting with lawmakers in Olympia. Because right now, under consideration in Olympia is a bipartisan bill, House Bill 1270, that would establish a commission for boys and men in Washington State. It would make us the first state to do so. And the idea is really there are some societal issues facing particularly males. You know, there's so much attention put on helping girls and helping women. And in a lot of areas, males have fallen behind. And, you know, it's not exactly a conversation that some people are willing to have to say, oh, well, men, you know, they're not discriminated against. But it's a really important conversation that's happening that I want you to know about. And I want you, if you're interested at the end of this interview, to advocate on behalf of House Bill 1270 to make sure that it gets a hearing this year and to really make Washington State the first state in the union to do something significant to help some of these particularly teen boys who are really struggling in society. So here's my conversation with Richard Reeves. Richard, thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
The insinuation that there is some sort of inequality we need to help males overcome, I imagine that doesn't go over well with some people.
Right. With some people, there's a knee-jerk reaction against like the very idea that there could be some inequalities that actually disfavor men and boys. I think we're so used to thinking about gender inequality as really just a synonym for the ways in which girls and women are behind. And to be fair, that has been mostly true for a long time. That I think there's just a kind of knee jerk, which is a kind of really reaction to it. So people do have that kind of visceral response, even to the topic sometimes. Yeah.
So how is it a topic that you got interested in?
Well, I have 3 sons, and all scholarship is at least partly autobiographical. It's just a question of whether you admit it or not. And so raising 3 boys, partly in the UK, where I'm originally from, and in the US, has been part of the story. And just seeing how different it is for them in many ways, figuring out how to be in the world, particularly as a young man. Even in the space of a generation, it's really changed. And there's a lot of confusion, a lot of disequilibrium, I think, around some of these issues for boys and men. So that was something that was like something I was talking about at home. But then in my day job at the Brookings Institution, I work on issues around employment, education, inequality, and I just kept stumbling across data points in many areas, including in things like college and school, where it was really pretty clear that there was a stark gender inequality that went the other way to the way that people typically think about it, and that was a really neglected discussion in public policy.
How old are your boys, can I ask?
They're in their 20s now, so my eldest is 27 and my youngest is 21.
When you started kind of having these conversations or this mindset that, hey, you know, there might be some inequalities here contrary to what we're being told, is that something that your boys recognized or felt, or that they were kind of completely blind to, that, yeah, maybe there are some societal things that are not working for me, when usually they're used to hearing it about girls?
Yeah, they were aware of it, and they were aware of and as was I through their eyes, of a disjunction between the facts as they knew them to be. For example, the fact that the girls at their high school were just doing so much better than the boys on average. And yet there were lots of opportunities for girls. There were scholarships for girls, there were girls' clubs, there were meetings aimed at helping girls get into college, etc. And then they would look at the data and realize that girls were twice as likely to go to a good college as the boys were. And so they felt this disjunction between, they looked around them and they saw that on average the girls were just doing much better than the boys, but the rhetoric was still very much about how do we help girls do better in education. And so they felt that disjunction, and then we'd end up talking about that at home. They didn't feel very comfortable talking about that at school. And so it would come home, and then of course I had lots of data points to share with them, and we would look up the school results and find out they weren't wrong to think the girls were doing better than them. And I tried to explain to them there used to be a world where girls weren't doing better in the education system, right? And I was like, really? What was that like? It was like, back in the land of dinosaurs, men were more likely to go to college than women. And they're like, really? You know, for them, it's sort of baked in that girls are going to do better at school. That's all they've ever known.
And your argument is not that there aren't certain things that girls and women have a harder time with.
No.
It's not one or the other.
No, that's part of the problem with political debate, isn't it? Is
Yeah.
it zero sum? Do you think A or B? And you're not allowed to think both. And actually, my wife is trying to raise money right now as a startup business. And so I know for a fact that female founders only get 3% of venture capital money. That's a fact that I'm reminded of on a daily basis. And I know that there are many areas where we still have to do more for women. I'd like to see more women in political life, for example, particularly in the US. And in some STEM areas, there's still real problems with women in tech, etc. Right? So we can talk about those at great length, and there are many organizations whose job it is to keep drawing our attention to the ways in which women and girls are still at a disadvantage. But it's quite clear now that there are very, very many areas where the opposite is the case, and we're not paying much attention to those.
Is the conversation that you're trying to start on this, is this something kind of brand new to the arena? Is there anyone else having these conversations or trying to push for these conversations?
I think there's lots of grassroots efforts, including, in Washington State, of course, where there's an active discussion about creating a commission on boys and men, which I hope we'll get to talk about. And what I've discovered is that there's a conversation going on within certain communities. So if you talk to school teachers, principals, they're really struggling with how their boys can do better. If you talk to people in care facilities or like juvenile detention facilities or foster care, they're all acutely aware that there are some really stark gender inequalities affecting boys and men. But it's very diffuse, it's very spread out. What there aren't institutions or organizations or very many organized voices that bring all of those together and say, okay, what does a kind of more pro-male agenda look like in those areas? There isn't an institutional architecture for that in the same way that there is for women and girls.
What impact do you think a pro-male agenda could have on our country, could have on maybe issues that we're having in the United States, societal issues?
Well, I'd hope that just at a straightforward public policy level, it could improve our systems. So the education system could be doing a much better job in terms of our boys. So more vocational training, more technical high schools, more apprenticeships, more male teachers, more opportunities for extracurricular activities that suit boys, a different style of learning so that it's more appropriate for boys as well as girls. So that would be a straightforward thing. Like when we have a bigger gender gap on our college campuses today than we did in 1972 when we passed Title IX, just the other way around, you've got to wonder whether the education system's still serving boys. When 2/3 of the people with the highest GPAs out of high schools are girls, you have to wonder. But there's something deeper going on here too, I think, which is that if boys and men feel as if they are having real problems, and they are in mental health, education, etc., and that those problems are not being given due attention, then I think that they can start to feel some real grievance. They can start to feel that they are being ignored and neglected. And then I think that causes all kinds of problems, because they'll then look for other people who are speaking to them and who are recognizing their problems are there. And if mainstream institutions are not doing that, then I think that can create some really difficult situations. I think it creates a vacuum in our society that then other people will fill. Somebody like Andrew Tate, the internet influencer, for example, is going to fill those sorts of spaces. And if we don't want him to be scripting what it means to be a man for our boys, well, we need to do a better job of it ourselves.
Well, and I think of more nefarious role models like gang members. I mean, we've had several instances in the last week in our state where it's young boys shooting, killing young boys. I mean, there was an incident not too far from here with, I think it was two 13-year-olds or a 13-year-old and two 15-year-olds stole a car at gunpoint, led police on a high-speed chase. And what I hear from legislators in Olympia is, gun restrictions and other ways to try to deal with this issue when the people committing these crimes are getting younger and younger, and they are obviously male. So when we talk about what's at stake here, how we could benefit from having a commission like the one we'll discuss in Washington State, how would you sell that for people? What's at stake in order for us? What's at stake when we look at should we do this or not?
Well, it's something like matters of life and death, as you've just described. And there's obviously the problems of crime that you'll see. And it's very clear that particularly adolescent boys and young men, if they don't have positive male role models, they are more likely to engage in antisocial activities. That's true. But on the other side of it, there's also the incredibly high rates of suicide that we see. And so there's the men who die at their own hands. And we know that suicide rates are 4 times higher among men than they are women. They account for almost 80% of the suicide deaths in Washington state, and they've risen by 25% in the last decade or so. And when you looked at the research as to what's driving those suicide rates, the two words that men use to describe themselves before they commit or attempt suicide most often are useless and worthless. And so I think what we're seeing here in some of the things like in suicide, in crime, etc., we're really seeing symptoms, very important symptoms to be clear, but symptoms of a deeper set of issues, which are our failure to properly engage with some of the sense of dislocation and difficulty that many of our boys and young men are having. And so we've really got to get to some of the root causes, I think, which are about like, how can we send a much more positive message? How can we equip our boys and men to flourish? Because we want our boys and men to flourish just as we want our women and girls to flourish. And back to where we were a moment ago, it's not a zero-sum game. But absent that, I fear that what we see, we end up trying to deal with symptoms. I can't remember who it was that said, it might have been Martin Luther King, but you'll correct me, that maybe it was Oliver Wendell Holmes. I'll keep guessing and then you'll tell me who it was. Who said that it's much easier to build fences at the top of cliffs than send ambulances to the bottom?
Your guess is as good as mine, but I like it.
That's basically what we're doing. We're always we're picking up the pieces in many of these areas, and instead we need to think it's how do we allow our boys to become so fractured in the first place?
So talk about what brings you to Washington State. You've been here for a couple of days now.
I have. So when I've been writing about these issues around boys and men, one of the things that I've really realized is the lack of an institutional focus. I've come to believe quite strongly that unless there are institutions whose job it is to be drawing attention to the trends facing boys and men, just as there are for women and girls, then it's going to get harder and it's harder to get policymakers to pay attention to it. Like, I've been really surprised how surprised people are when I share the facts with them about what's happening to boys and men. And then I realize I've been looking at this stuff for years, but they don't know that because it's no one's job to draw their attention to the fact that we have these huge gaps in education and suicide and employment. It's no one's job to wake up every day and say, what does this mean for boys and men? Is that policy working for boys and men? How are boys and men doing? How did COVID affect boys and men? Right? Huge effects on boys and men. But whose job was it to draw our attention to that? And the answer is kind of no one.
Well, because there's always this, what impact did it have on people of color, on poor communities?
Yes.
I mean, what impact did something have on women? But I will admit, not even I ever think of, what impact did that have on boys and men?
Yeah, but COVID's a great example of this, and I draw on it in the book, which is there were just so many reports on how was COVID affecting women and girls. And many of the concerns about actually women and girls and COVID turned out to be unfounded, thankfully. But nonetheless, there was just a stream of reports on it. And that was just institutions doing their job. That was commissions and offices and councils on women and girls waking up and saying, COVID's happened. What does that mean for our group being women and girls? Great. But there was no equivalent group doing stuff for men. So just as a kind of slight side note, I ended up writing quite a lot about the fact that COVID was killing men in much greater numbers than women. And it was really hard to get that published and get people to pay attention to it, even though it's true, because there wasn't a constituency for that story.
What do you mean? People were like, oh, it's just boys and men. What do you mean there wasn't a constituency for it?
There wasn't a commission or an office or a council. There's no Office of Men's Health. There's no UN division on men's health. There's no centre on men and public policy, but there are all of the equivalents for women. There's no national coalition of boys and men in education, but there is a national coalition of women and girls in education. And so there are people whose job it is to be drawing attention to the ways in which trends are different for women and girls, or how an impact like COVID, what it's doing for women and girls. And so what really struck me was the fact that we needed more of these institutions. We needed commissions, etc. And then, lo and behold, Washington State is actively considering the creation of a commission on boys and men, which would be a complement to the existing one on women, which was created in 2018. And if that is established, it would be the first in the nation. It would be the first fully fledged commission on boys and men in the US. There's some international movement on this. Norway has just created a commission on boys and men, which is interesting. One of the most gender egalitarian countries in the world is waking up to the fact that boys and men are struggling. And so I've been meeting with various stakeholders in the area to see what's going on and to see if I can bring any research to bear on that. But it's an exciting moment, I think, that you can have this bipartisan effort to actually take seriously the fact that boys and men might need some attention too.
Yeah, it's for people who are not familiar, it's House Bill 1270. What I thought was interesting is not only is there bipartisan support for it, it's a really diverse group that's supporting it. You had a couple meetings in Olympia this past week. What was the attendance like in terms of Democrats, Republicans, men, women?
A good mix. Again, I was able to meet with a good representative sample of both men and women and Democrats and Republicans. It is striking that both the sponsor and the lead co-sponsor are both women.
Yeah.
And so you have Representative Dye, who's a Republican, who's put the bill down, but Amy Wallen, Representative Wallen, who's the Democrat, who's come in as the lead co-sponsor. Women, also mums. And it's very interesting how much energy is coming from mothers who are worried about boys, worried about their sons, who are really feeling this at quite a visceral level. But I'm also pleased that there are, almost as many men as women who've also signed up to it too. So, and I think it's critical that this is not seen as a partisan issue. If this is somehow, like if one side is in favor of women and the other side is in favor of men, then we're in real trouble, right? The very last thing we want is a women's party and a men's party.
That wouldn't surprise me, though, if we come into that.
Well, there have been some slight trends in that direction. I'm a bit worried about the way there's some gender sorting going on. But I think for this kind of commission to have the effect we would like it to have, then it has to have bipartisan support. If it's seen as just the tool of one party as opposed to the other, then obviously it won't be successful.
But about that kind of initial reaction you sort of get to people when you want to focus on boys and men, because I think you mentioned earlier that there isn't like this infrastructure to help boys and men. There aren't these institutional things, which rose out of sexism, which there was sexism. I mean,
Right.
we did deal with that in a very real way. And
Yep.
so that's why you had for decades this emphasis on, okay, let's put things in place to help women.
Yes.
Have we gone too far in that direction?
I find the gone too far discussion quite difficult because there are still some issues facing women and girls. But it's also, I think, just because it really has to be borne in mind that this has happened very quickly. So if you look at a lot of the institutions that were created on behalf of women and girls, it was in the 70s and 80s, including in education and so on. And then within a couple of decades, in education at least, women had not only caught up with them, but blown right past them, which nobody
We're very
expected.
sharp.
Right? It was unbelievable. I mean, really, honestly, all we had to do was take the brakes off the women and girls for them to just blow right past.
Yeah.
And no one expected that. And so you create these institutions, you fund them, you create a constituency around them, and then almost the next day, they achieve their goals. What are they supposed to do? Just say, okay, all right, we're done, and shut it out. And so I'm quite cognizant of the fact that when you get changes of this rapidity, it is difficult for institutional architectures to catch up. And so I don't think it's helpful to start saying we don't need these institutions on behalf of women and girls. I think there are still many issues that they should continue to deal with. I think the problem is the asymmetry now. I think the problem is if we only have institutions that are drawing attention to the issues of women and girls, and there are no equivalent ones for boys and men, it does create an asymmetry when the trends have gone so strongly the other way in many areas.
Is it fair to compare it to how this nation has dealt with race? We had, obviously, slavery, our original sin, and everything that resulted from slavery. And now, you had institutions put in place, efforts put in place to equal the playing field. But in Seattle, we have these DEI efforts, diversity, equity, inclusion, which, there's been lawsuits over them. This white City of Seattle employee who says he was told to resign because he was holding other people of color back from promotion. Stories like that. Is it fair to compare what the trajectory we've taken on gender issues with the trajectory we've taken on issues of race?
I resist the parallel for various reasons. One is that we need to think about both of them together. And if you to use the term intersectionality properly, what that requires you to do is to recognize the fact that, for example, white women have overtaken black men in the labor market by an extraordinary degree. So for every dollar earned by a white woman, a black man earns 84 cents. Whereas in 1979, black men earned more than white women. And so what's peculiar about the US is the position of particular racial groups, and I would draw attention to black Americans. So I say in the book, I'm not a very big fan of the term people of color.
Okay.
Because that suggests that the main dividing line is between white people and everybody else.
Correct.
And I think that's just empirically crazy when you look at the kind of different trends for different groups, Asian Americans with higher levels of wealth and education and so on than white Americans. So it gets pretty messy pretty quickly, but also because I think it misstates the fact that there are still really kind of extraordinary disadvantages faced by black Americans. At least that's what the data suggests. And in particular, this is where it gets more interesting from a gender point of view, black boys and men. And so black boys and men are pretty much at the bottom of almost every one of the tables you want to worry about in terms of education, whereas black women are doing much better on lots of measures. And so there are, for example, there are now slightly more black women with a postgraduate degree, young black women, than young white men. Black women are very upwardly mobile when it comes to their individual income. Black girls graduate high school on time in higher numbers than white boys, etc. And so when you start thinking about race and gender together, you get a very different story. And in particular, what you see is that the gap between black boys and black girls in our schools is huge, much bigger than for any other race. And so what I think that means is that there are still some distinct things about race, but you have to layer gender onto that as well and ask, okay, so what's happening to our black boys and men in particular?
So is it just a matter of having this be very specific? Because now my question is going to be, why not do a commission for black boys and men? If they have, I'm assuming that they have different challenges they're facing than white boys and men. And so is it just a matter of within that institution treating them differently?
Well, what I think we do is through any of these lenses, like a gender lens on women. Let's say you're looking at the gender pay gap, right? Let's say you're worried about the gender pay gap. What you do is say, well, who is the one that's suffering most in the gender pay gap? And you might find out it's certain women in particular, and it's not professional women. And what you find out, it's more of a parenting pay gap, and so it's really around what happens when you have children, right? The gender pay gap is largely a parenting pay gap. And so the data should lead you to look at particular subgroups. And there are lots of initiatives that are focused on black boys and men, and I support those. But there are other issues where the story gets more complicated. So, for example, when it comes to suicide, it's white men who are at the highest risk of suicide by some margin. And so it depends on the issue at hand. And that becomes an empirical question. You should just go to the data and you say, okay, so we have this big, massive gender gap in suicide. We're worried about that. We should be worried about that. So then the next question is, okay, who are the men we should be most worried about? And in that case, it turns out to be white men, particularly middle-aged, working-class white men. So, okay, what's happening with middle-aged, white, working-class men that's leading them to take their own lives? And so you're driven by the data to then look at kind of particular subgroups. And so I think that's why having a particular lens of boys and men might lead you to be concerned about different groups of boys and men depending on the issue at hand.
There's a part of me that thinks that all sounds very complicated, and why not just strip all these identity-focused efforts and just let everybody fend for themselves?
Yeah, well, that is an argument that I think it has a lot of merit intellectually. And maybe we will get to that point. Maybe we'll get to a point where we can just say, look, why do we have all these commissions on different groups? Why do we need to sort of have a women's commission, an LGBTQ commission, a race equity commission, a boys and men commission, etc.? Why don't we just get rid of all of them and then just say, let's have a good school system?
Right, that's what I'm saying,
right,
yes.
Right. And that has a certain attractive ring to it, for sure. And maybe we will get to that at some point. But as things stand, if there are certain groups who are struggling in particular ways or suffering in particular ways in different domains, I think it still makes sense to have some people whose job it is to say, okay, well, what does this mean for this group here? The danger, of course, is that it just becomes a bit of a war of all against all. But I think if we're also being realistic about this, there is a women's commission in almost every US state right now.
Yeah.
And I do not see any prospect of them going away, and nor do I think they should, given where we currently are in terms of the issues facing girls and women. So I think it's more of just balancing, and then they can work together and become more complementary. And maybe some of the inequalities we're worried about will diminish to such an extent that we don't need that specific focus. Or rather, what I'd really like is for the education system to just say, we want a good school system that works for everybody. Which means we look at who it's working for and who it isn't, and then address the people that it's not. That would include, say, black boys, or it might include rural white boys, or working class white boys in rural, whatever it is, right? Yeah. Without the need for these institutions nudging them and poking them. But as things stand, I'm not confident that that would happen. And so I think actually having some vested interests in, just poking to just say, don't forget about this group, don't forget about this group, is kind of where we are right now.
Yeah, and I like the idea of parity in this instance, because you're right, you have it on for women and girls, and I think there are so many societal issues, and we'll touch on them in a second, that are focusing on boys and men. I think my fear is when we get into there's the commission for bisexual white men with one blue eye and one green eye and red hair.
Yeah. It just goes all the way down potentially. Yeah, but you're right. But I think that there is sufficient evidence for pretty big gender inequalities in both directions that I think it still makes sense to that is half the population in each case, and so I think there's something to be said for looking at both, and maybe we'll get to a point where we don't need that for either, but we're a long way from that right now.
So you said sometimes when you tell people about the numbers, about the data, they're very surprised by it. And I will say, in reading House Bill 1270, there's some data in here I was really surprised by. It talks about, homelessness is a huge issue in our state. And it said in 2022 in Washington, 63% of individuals experiencing homelessness were male. Of the people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, 70% were male. It also said males had higher rates of substance abuse, another issue that has become a crisis in Washington state. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think it's 70% of opioid deaths are male. Certainly that's the national number. I don't know what the state figure is. I think the homelessness number might even be a little bit higher nationally. And I think actually what's happened is that the welfare system, if I can use that term very broadly, has evolved in such a way as to really be focused on support for women with children. And in many cases does a pretty good job. I mean, many people on the left would argue it's not doing a good enough job, and I think we could do a better job. But what it doesn't do a very good job of is kind of taking care of men, particularly if they're not the primary carers of children, and that's true in our health system, in our housing system, etc. And so it's easier to fall through the cracks of those various systems if you're a man. And so I think what you see there is the fact that we have a kind of a safety net, if you like, that is kind of focused more on protecting women with children. And I'm not actually passing judgment on whether it's a good or a bad thing. You have to make some decisions about who to focus on. I think focusing on children is right, but it does mean that you end up sometimes missing some of the men. And then there's a kind of vicious circle at work, because if men aren't in their kids' lives, or they don't feel like they're kind of needed by their family, then that reduces incentives around employment. If they're not in employment, then they're obviously going to be at high risk of being poor. If they're poor, they may be unhoused and so on. So there's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and you brought up something I think is important there, and we always have this conversation, particularly when we talk about young men involved in crime, about what's happening at the household. I mean, you can start a commission for boys and men, the government can do outreach or whatever it is, but how do you account for the dynamics at home that might be negatively influencing the life of a young man?
Well, I think you have to be aware of the impact that it might be having. Mm-hmm. So first of all, let's start with the evidence. And the evidence is that fathers really matter, especially to boys. There's no doubt about that anymore. And so to the extent that we want our boys to do better, it's true of girls too, but especially true for boys, then we want engaged, responsible fatherhood. Next question. Is public policy or society more generally supporting responsible, engaged fatherhood? If not, what can we do about it? And so it's interesting that just today, as we're recording this, that we've seen the announcement that the US military has increased the amount of paid leave for fathers from 3 weeks to 3 months. That's pretty good if you're in the military. But what about civilians? And what's interesting about that is the kind of recognition that dads really matter, right? And so we've recognized our military dads really matter, but that's true of our civilian dads as well. And very often the legal system, particularly for unmarried fathers, can be quite difficult for them to navigate, especially around the child support system as well. And so particularly unmarried fathers can actually get tangled up in some quite difficult bureaucracies. Now, I don't think we've updated our systems sufficiently to help fathers in particular. If we start with the presumption that dads matter, then if we had a commission whose job it was to be looking through the lens of boys and men, I think it would, and in fact fatherhood is one of the issues that the commission is being tasked with addressing, then I think we'd look harder at the ways in which our policies were either inadvertently or advertently disadvantaging dads, which they clearly are right now.
I know it's still up in the air as to whether this House bill is going to be a priority this legislative session for the majority party. If Washington is able to do this, if they move forward with something that no other state has done, do you think it'll be a domino?
I do. I know of other states who are looking at Washington State and considering bills of their own to create a Boys and Men Commission along similar lines. The mood on this issue has definitely shifted in the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years. There's an appetite now across the political spectrum to just take more seriously the issues faced by boys and men. They're not going away. They are clearly affecting family life. They're hurting women as well as men. And I really think the penny's dropping now. And so what would have been seen, I think, is in some ways seems like a crazy idea, like an extreme idea, from men's rights activist idea, is now being really seriously discussed by people of all political stripes. And so I think that if Washington State goes, others will follow. But I also just think that the tide has turned anyway, and so other states I think are quite likely to move in this direction. But in some ways, this is a great place because obviously pretty mixed politically, but leans a bit Dem at the moment. And so I think it would be a really good signal to other states to say that this is not a partisan issue. This is not a conservative issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's an us issue. It's a family issue. It's a community issue. And so I think it would be great if there was to be progress here, because I think that would create a different kind of conversation. I think what I'm trying to do in my work, but I think that this commission could do too, is just create a space in which we can have a straightforward conversation like this about these problems and what can we do about them, and take it away from some of the heat of the culture war where you've got to choose sides. And by being in favor of boys and men, you've said you're not in favor of women and girls, as if somehow if you're a parent of a son and a daughter, you have to choose which one to love.
Yeah. It's this almost effort to decide, well, who's more problematized? Who do we have to focus on more? Yes. When it's like there's a lot of people having different issues.
Who's the bigger victim?
Right. Who's the bigger victim? Richard Reeves, you are so damn smart. And I love this conversation because it's just not one you hear about very often. I think because a lot of people are scared to just have it in an honest way. How can people follow your work and give us a final pitch for your book?
Yeah, so they can follow me at the Brookings Institution, where I'm proud to say we now have a Boys and Men project looking at these issues. And I have a Substack called Of Boys and Men, which is also the title of my book. And I'd encourage people to check those out. Please get in touch with me. I'd love to learn what people are doing. I'm really inspired by the stories of the teachers and the community leaders and the coaches and the pastors who are just really taking this issue seriously. I'm incredibly moved when I hear from people that this is important to them, and people are so grateful that we're having this conversation that it tells me that there's really an appetite for this. And so please get in touch with me and support these efforts. And
let's end with this. Your advice to parents of boys.
Your boys, or your boy, is unique. There's only one of him. And he is precious. He's precious in my sight, in your sight. Make sure he knows that. Make sure that every time he has difficulty at school or is struggling with how to be in the world, that you have his back, that you've got him, that if he's struggling, it's not because there's something wrong with him, and that he is every bit as valuable in all his differences than his sister or his fellow classmates. And just know that all of us are equal, and that applies just as much to boys and men too. And that anybody that tells him he's the problem and that what he needs to do is just be less of himself, or that there's something wrong with masculinity or something wrong with boys and men, is not his friend, because that's not true. And anyone who tells him that is leading him down the wrong path. And if he knows that, and if he hears that from his mum and his sister and his dad and his coach, that we love you as you are, and that boys are great. And I have 3 boys and I'm a guy, and it's great. And and you learn to be mature, and you learn how to be a good man in the world. But boys don't become men just automatically. That takes work. And most of all, it takes love. And sometimes I think we forget that our boys need our love and respect just as much as anybody else.
So we appreciate Richard taking the time to join us. Fascinating conversation, such an interesting guy, such an interesting point of view. So again, this is House Bill 1270. It has bipartisan support. The hope is that it can move this legislative session. So take some time to email your elected representative in the House and the Senate for your district and tell them to take a look at House Bill 1270 and let them know why it's important to invest in boys and men. It's Friday. That means it's time for our segment, Florida Report.
It's not even controversial anymore.
People know in Florida their freedoms are going to be respected.
Joining us is my sister Miranda. Hello, we've got some Ron DeSantis story. So Ron DeSantis wants to extend something that was already in place, but basically punishments for private businesses that mandate the COVID vaccine.
Correct. He basically wants to make it so that people can still become employed if they personally choose to not get the COVID vaccine or the boosters. So this law that he has that he wants to extend would put in penalties for businesses that would require vaccines of anybody that wants to work there and stuff. And in addition to that, he also wants to continue not requiring people to wear masks in public schools and in government buildings and stuff like that. So I think he just wants to take what he's kind of already done these last couple of years. This law that he put into place actually expires in June. So I think he's reviving the conversation now so that he can move forward to continue what he's been doing in our state for the last couple of years.
Yeah, I don't mind the schools and the government building ones. I do mind him trying to kind of pressure private businesses because I'm just opposed to government interference in the private sector as much as possible. I know you can't avoid some of it, but to me, that's like just letting the free market, if this business wants to do that and then people decide not to work there. So that to me seems a little counterproductive. I'm not in favor of vaccine mandates, but I just don't know if I like the governor saying we're going to punish a private business if it chooses to impose a vaccine mandate.
Yeah, because and honestly, it sounded like it could snowball, are you going to wind up, how are you going to punish these businesses? Like some people have businesses that, require very close proximity with other humans. So you would kind of think that those businesses should be allowed to make the requirements that are necessary for them on their own terms. And then, like you said, people can decide whether or not they want to work there based off of those requirements. I don't know if it's just something he's talking about because it gets people excited and it gets them on his side. But we'll see what sticks and what doesn't when it comes to that. I kind of like the mask thing. It's nice not knowing that you'll never be required to wear a mask in this regard towards COVID-19 again is kind of a nice feeling because I still have mine. Just in case this comes back, I'm like, should I keep these? I just kept them around. I hope they become ancient relics and we never have to go down that road again.
You won't ever be required to wear a mask again in Florida, but I am not so confident in Washington state that eventually that won't come back. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see this. I just think with private businesses, do I think vaccine mandates make any sense at all for the COVID-19 vaccine, given the fact it doesn't stop the spread? No. So it doesn't make sense to me. I just don't know if I like that kind of government overreach. Ron DeSantis also kind of continuing his push to, in his view, improve public education. And he's banned a certain course.
Yeah, so there was an African Americans AP studies class that was going through a bit of a pilot program in Florida. And him and his administration has officially taken that one off the table. It kind of falls into his education reform that he's been trying to push the last couple of years that doesn't allow people in high schools to talk about anything related with sexual identity, race, gender identity, I guess is the same as sexual identity and things like that. I don't know. I think that if it's an AP class means it's elective and you do not have to take it. So AP classes to me are just a great window into the future of extended education. And if kids are interested in something, they should be allowed to continue that education on their own choice. So to like take it off the table entirely is kind of unproductive to limit education for kids who want it.
Yeah, I'm kind of on board. I've got like two stories of things Ron DeSantis is doing that I don't necessarily agree with, which is rare. Usually I like what he does. Yeah, I do wonder how much of this is like for headlines, because you're right. If it was required, that's different. If it's elected, you elect to take it, that's a different scenario. Now, do I think that there is way too much of a push on race issues and gender issues in public education? Absolutely. But if students have the choice whether to take it or not, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And there's also like women's studies. I took a women's studies course in college. I don't know why. I don't even remember what it was about. But yeah, that's interesting. I don't know how I feel about Ron today. Let's end with a fun one. What you got for us?
Well, fun for us, but maybe not fun for this innocent yoga goer that was just attending a nice afternoon of free yoga in the park on a beautiful day in Florida when we were having our Florida freeze. They were, I believe, in the Shavasana part of the yoga where you relax at the end and kind of enjoy everything that you took in for the course, and an iguana fell on his face.
Is he okay?
He says he's okay, but he did say it felt like he got hit in the face with a sandbag. So it must have been a fairly decent sized iguana, and they did end the class to get him, the attention that he needed medically, because I think he wound up with a few scrapes and stuff. But he didn't want to release his name because he doesn't want to be known as the guy who was a landing pad for an iguana.
I can't blame him. Like to the end of time, when somebody Googles you, it comes up that you got hit in the face with an iguana doing yoga.
For sure. You got to do something pretty extra to get away from that title if that happened to you. But it's proof that what we have been saying for a few weeks on Florida Report, that it does happen. The iguanas do fall out of trees and they can land on you. So
and it would hurt.
And it would hurt. They have claws and everything. So I can't imagine that iguana was too excited to land on him anyway. He probably scratched his way and ran off. But
yeah. Oh, well, the iguana's okay, right?
The iguana is okay. I don't think that he stuck around to apologize by any means. And I'm sure this guy needed a whole nother yoga class after to relax, because I'm sure he got pretty worked up getting a lizard on his face.
Well, I mean, they do goat yoga where the goat climbs on you during yoga. They could do lizard yoga, iguana yoga.
It's true. And I mean, I think that if people were expecting the iguanas at the yoga class, it'd be different. But when you're just trying to take in some sunshine and you're sitting at a beautiful park with a breeze and the ocean in front of you, you're not really looking forward to having a lizard fall on you. So
I like it. Only in Florida. Miranda, thank you.
Very welcome.
It's not even controversial anymore.
People know in Florida their freedoms are going to be respected.
All right, to end the show, I wanted to read some of your many, many comments on my interview with Washington Governor Jay Inslee. I will say, and it didn't sink in that day. So when I approached that interview, and again, it happened on Cairo Radio, where I'm filling that noon to 3 slot after the death of Dory Monson. And, Dory would be mortified if I used the time with the governor to talk about him. But I thought, well, of course the governor is going to want to say something about Dory's passing. That's just the kind thing to do. Even if he doesn't really mean it, he's going to say something. Of course he would say something. And so at the beginning of the interview, I kind of set him up to give him an opportunity. I brought up Dory, and he totally blew past it. Not at the beginning, not at the end. And in hindsight, I looked back at that. I'm mortified by that. That the fact that he wouldn't even muster a kind word or, hey, it's a loss, or I'm sorry to hear about this. That speaks volumes to me. I can't believe his staff wouldn't tell him, like, hey, muster a kind word about Dory. But that being aside, all right, Stacy says, all I really heard Inslee say is that he's going to do whatever he wants, no matter what. That's Stacy on Patreon. Yeah, that's probably true. David writes, let me get this straight. The governor, in an attempt to provide more housing, wishes to significantly tax a population that is struggling to afford housing. And he's going to do that to pay for more housing. Can someone explain to me? No, David, I can't explain that situation to you. Let's see. Jackie says, I do give the office props for being ballsy enough to do a phone interview with you, but damn, all I can do is shake my head. I got a lot of, like I said, I'm shocked that he did an interview with me. I don't know the motivation of doing it. If he thinks that he's really trying to sell this housing plan, this $4 billion bond issue he wants voters to weigh in on, I'm not really sure. Kevin wrote, Brandi, well done. Can't ask everything in 15 minutes, but you were very direct and did not treat him as the rest of the local media would have, kissing his rear. My goodness, did he duck and dodge your reasonable questions? I honestly expected him to pull the fire alarm and then say he has to go. Martin said, another outstanding show. Inslee is disgusting. Big money grab in the name of homelessness. Well, I don't think Inslee's disgusting. I think that he should find another job besides governor. One more we can fit in. Aaron on Patreon. Brandi, your facial expressions while Inslee was speaking his nonsense had me laughing so hard. Love how on top of the facts you are. That's so funny because I realized that after the fact, like, wow, I was not controlling my facial expressions very well, where he'd say something, I'd be like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Especially on the vaccine issue. And we can play that clip here again. At the start of this legislative session, you noted that one of our biggest challenges, we're in the middle of a serious workforce shortage. So, Governor, will you commit today, right now, to rehiring workers who were fired under your vaccine mandate if they choose to come back?
Sure. If they comply with our rules for their application, of course we will.
If they get a vaccine, you're saying?
Correct. And that really is, we believe, the right decision. This is still a dangerous disease. It is still taking lives. And we don't want people to miss work because they get COVID. We want a healthy workforce so that they can do their jobs. And, I've seen the dangers of people who did not become vaccinated. I know you've had a couple people on this show that were anti-vaxxers and their families lost them to COVID. They were very vocal of how our requirement was so terrible, and then their family lost them to COVID. That's really sad and disturbing. So we don't want our state employees to have to go through that.
But here's where I say, and I said on Twitter, and this is a good chance for you. Ready? I will quit my job and retire full-time from political commentary if you can justify the current state of your vaccine mandate. And let me tell you why. I got the vaccine, Governor, a year and a half ago because I believed it was our path out of the pandemic. When I realized it wasn't, I opted not to get the boosters. A year and a half later, that vaccine is no longer protecting me. Yet I can go get a job with the state. But someone who never got the vaccine, who today has the same level of protection as me, which is none, cannot get a job with the state. How does that make sense?
What makes sense is for people to get this booster. That's what I can.
But it's not mandated. So technically, I could get. Right. I could get hired with the state, right? But the vaccine is no longer in my body.
I hear what you're saying. We have to reach agreements with our state employees. We reached agreement with them. I have to deal as a manager with our unions. We reached an agreement on this. But I really do encourage people to get this booster because it really is important to give you the protection against serious illness or losing your life. And I hope that you will share that scientific information for people.
To me, and again, I'm so confident in saying I'll quit my job if you can justify this. It's not justifiable. It truly is not justifiable. And so, he wants to tell people, well, get the booster, but you'll hire people who have no vaccine protection. There's no efficacy of the vaccine left in their body. That just simply doesn't make any sense. All right, that's it for today's episode of Undivided. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your commitment to giving common sense a comeback. I particularly appreciate those of you who have subscribed on Patreon to help support the growth of this show. You can do that for $5 a month at patreon.com/undivided or by becoming a contributor on my locals community, brandykruse.locals.com.